A baboon was once a legally employed railway worker with a flawless 9-year record. A bear held military rank and earned the respect of soldiers who had seen real combat. And somewhere in a government archive, there are official documents describing a serious plan to weaponize sleeping bats. None of this is fiction. None of this is exaggerated. This is just history doing what history does best, which is proving that the human mind, when left unsupervised, will arrive at conclusions that no reasonable person could have predicted. And the deeper you dig, the stranger it gets. I have spent a long time going through old records, forgotten reports, and accounts that most history classes quietly skip over. And what I found was not a collection of cute animal stories. It was something closer to a mirror. Every single one of these moments, no matter how absurd it looks from the outside, made complete sense to the people living it. That is the part that stays with you. Not the weirdness of the act itself, but the total confidence with which it was carried out. These were not fringe ideas whispered in back rooms. They were funded, organized, sometimes celebrated, and in more cases than you would expect, they actually worked. What I want to do is walk you through the ones that stopped me cold. The ones where I had to put down whatever I was reading and just sit with the fact that this happened. Some of them are darkly funny. Some of them are uncomfortable. Some of them will make you look at the world around you slightly differently, because once you see how many times in history an animal quietly ended up doing the work that held everything together, you start noticing the pattern everywhere. We think of progress as this clean upward line, technology improving, systems getting smarter, humans figuring things out in increasingly rational ways. But the actual story is messier and stranger, and honestly much more interesting than that. The actual story involves court-appointed lawyers for livestock, living reptiles worn as fashion accessories by people who considered themselves the peak of civilization, and a military program that got derailed because the animals escaped early and burned the wrong building. So let us start there, with the idea that a problem and a ridiculous solution are sometimes closer together than anyone wants to admit, and work our way through 33 moments where humanity looked at an animal and made a choice that nobody should have made. And yet, here we are. If you are enjoying this already, do us a favor and hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and there is a lot more where this came from. Now, picture a large commercial farm, early morning, the kind of quiet that smells like hay and cold metal and something faintly sour underneath. The workers arrive before sunrise because that is just how it works on a farm. And within the first hour of any given day, somebody is already dealing with a problem that has no clean solution. The birds are hurting each other, not occasionally, constantly. The aggression moves through a flock the way a rumor moves through a school, fast and contagious and completely out of proportion to whatever started it. Blood is visible, and the moment it appears, it draws more attention, more pecking, more chaos, until the whole operation is losing money in a way that is quiet but relentless. You cannot medicate it away. You cannot separate every bird. The environment itself is the trigger, specifically color, specifically red. And no amount of rearranging fixes the fact that the birds are wired to respond to it. So someone, and I genuinely wish I knew who, sat down and arrived at the following conclusion. What if we changed what they see? Not the environment, not the flock structure. The actual visual input of every single bird, What if we put tinted lenses on them? And before you laugh, which is the correct response, understand that this person then went and had those lenses manufactured. In volume, millions of units. Small rose-colored plastic pieces fitted to a beak, designed specifically so that the color triggering the aggression would simply not register the same way anymore. They distributed them. Farmers bought them. And the thing is, they kept buying them because the results were real enough that nobody wanted to go back. Somewhere on a working farm, rows of birds were going about their day wearing tinted eyewear, completely unbothered, while the humans around them had just normalized the single most surreal image in agricultural history. And that is where this whole story begins, not with some grand invention or a war or a king making a decree, but with one completely unhinged practical decision that worked just enough to prove something important. When people are desperate enough and creative enough and just a little bit willing to look completely ridiculous, the solutions they find tend to be unforgettable. The wealthiest women in one of the most powerful civilizations in human history used live snakes as a cooling accessory, and their social circle considered this completely normal. Not a scandal, not a rumor, a fashion choice. Let that land for a second. We just talked about tinted glasses on farm birds, which already feels like a lot, but that was at least solving a practical agricultural problem. This is something else entirely. This is what happens when wealth removes every obstacle between a person and their worst idea, and the people around them are too impressed to say anything useful. The setting matters here. Imagine a city at the height of its power, marble everywhere, the smell of cedar oil and warm stone baking in the afternoon heat, the kind of heat that sits on your shoulders like something physical. Wealthy households had servants, shade, cool rooms, every advantage available. And still, for some women moving through formal social settings, the heat was a problem that demanded a solution that matched their status. Not a fan, not a wet cloth, something that communicated refinement while also actually working. And someone, at some point, reached the conclusion that a large, living, cold-blooded animal draped across the shoulders was the answer. The logic, when you follow it, is not completely insane. Reptiles regulate their temperature externally. Their skin stays genuinely cool to the touch. Pressed against warm skin on a hot day, the sensation would have been immediate and real. This was not purely decorative. It functioned. But here's the part that gets me every time. The social environment around this choice normalized it so completely that it became a status marker. Owning the right kind of snake, keeping it calm enough to wear, having the composure to carry a living reptile through a formal gathering without flinching. That was the signal. Not wealth exactly, but control. The appearance of total mastery over your environment, including the living parts of it. And if you think that impulse belongs only to ancient history, I would ask you to look at any era where the ultra-wealthy have competed through increasingly strange displays of ownership and taste. The animal changes. The dynamic does not. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Because while one part of history was busy turning animals into accessories for the powerful, another part was quietly doing something that flips the whole power structure upside down. And it starts with a man who lost everything and rebuilt it using help that nobody could have predicted. His name was Daniel, and by the time this story begins, he had already been through more than most people face in a lifetime. An accident on the job had taken the use of both his legs, and with it went his livelihood, his independence, and probably a significant portion of his confidence in how the world worked. He had been a signalman on a busy rail line, responsible for operating switches that kept trains moving safely in the right direction. Precise work, timing-dependent work. The kind of job where a slow reaction is not just an error, but a disaster. After the accident, returning to that work in any conventional sense was not an option anyone was offering him. But Daniel was not looking for a conventional option. What he found instead, through circumstances that started almost as a practical joke, was a young baboon that someone was trying to sell near the rail yard. He bought the animal. He brought him home. And then, over weeks and months, in a process that must have looked completely unhinged to anyone watching from the outside, he started teaching in the signals. The animal, who Daniel called Rex, turned out to have something that cannot be trained into a creature that does not already possess it, which is genuine attention. Rex watched. Rex repeated. Rex learned which lever corresponded to which signal and which sequence of events meant a train was coming from the south versus the north. When the rail authority found out that a primate was operating safety-critical equipment on an active line, the reaction was exactly what you would expect. Inspectors arrived. Tests were arranged. Everyone prepared for the embarrassing confirmation of what they already assumed. Rex performed without a single error. He was placed on the official payroll, compensated in food, and given a daily ration that Daniel negotiated on his behalf. And for nearly a decade, not one signaling mistake was recorded on that stretch of line. The inspectors who came to shut the whole thing down ended up writing a report that essentially said, "We cannot find a problem here." Think about what that means. A system designed by humans, maintained by humans, overseen by humans, was quietly being held together by an animal that nobody had planned for. And the humans responsible for that system had to look at their paperwork and officially acknowledge it. That is not just a strange story. That is something much more unsettling, and we are only getting started. There was a period in history when the most educated, most refined, most culturally celebrated people in certain societies spent their afternoons throwing live animals into the air for entertainment and called it sport. Not a fringe group, not people on the edges of society, the inner circle, the ones who set the standard for what was considered tasteful and impressive. We have already seen what wealth does when it removes friction from bad ideas. The snake worn like a scarf. The inspector who could not find fault with a baboon running a rail signal. But those stories at least had some internal logic buried underneath the strangeness. This one does not. This one is just what happens when powerful people get bored and nobody around them has the standing to say, "Stop." The gatherings where this happened were formal affairs. Guests arrived dressed in heavy fabrics that smelled of cedar and perfumed powder, the kind of clothing that required help to put on, and communicated very clearly that the person wearing it did not do physical labor. The grounds were manicured. The air carried the sound of music from somewhere inside the building. And then, in a designated outdoor space, the entertainment would begin. Animals, usually foxes, were brought out in cages. A pair of participants would take up their positions on opposite ends of a braided sling laid flat on the ground. The animal was released onto the sling, and then they pulled. The goal was height. The crowd watched and judged and applauded based on how high the animal went. That was it. That was the whole thing. And the people doing it were not considered cruel by their peers. They were considered skilled. There were techniques. There were reputations built on this. Some participants became known for their form, the timing of the pull, the arc they could achieve. It was treated with the same social seriousness as any other competitive skill of the era. What makes this story so difficult to sit with is not just the act itself. It is the gap between self-image and reality. These were people who wrote poetry, commissioned art, debated philosophy, and genuinely believed they represented the highest point of human culture. And on a Tuesday afternoon, they were doing this. That gap between what people believe about themselves and what their choices reveal is one of the most consistent things in all of history, and it does not belong only to the past. Now, if aristocratic boredom is one kind of danger, wartime desperation is a completely different category, and what comes next sits in a place where those two things almost overlap, because what I am about to describe was officially funded, seriously developed, and very nearly deployed. And the person who proposed it was not a general or a weapons engineer. He was a doctor. The year does not matter as much as the circumstances. A major war was being fought across multiple fronts. Resources were being stretched in ways that made previously unthinkable ideas suddenly worth considering. And a proposal arrived through official channels suggesting that small nocturnal animals, the kind that sleep through the day and navigate in total darkness, could be converted into delivery systems for incendiary devices. The doctor who wrote it had done the math. He had studied the architecture of the target areas, dense wooden structures packed closely together, the kind that catch and spread fire fast. He had calculated how many animals would be needed, how the devices would be attached, how the animals would be transported and released. He had thought about the timing, dawn, when the animals would naturally seek shelter in the dark, enclosed spaces of rooftops and wall gaps. And then the small, timed devices would do the rest. The proposal was not dismissed. It was funded. A dedicated team was assembled. Specially designed containers were built to hold thousands of animals in a state of induced cold sleep for transport. The attachment method for the devices was tested and refined. Field trials were organized. And in one of those trials, a group of animals woke up earlier than the schedule required and got loose inside the test facility. By the time anyone understood what was happening, part of the facility was burning, not the target, the building where the researchers worked. Nobody had planned for that specific outcome, which in retrospect seems like exactly the kind of thing someone should have planned for. The project continued after that. It took a completely separate and far larger development elsewhere to finally pull the funding and shut it down. But here's what stays with me about this story. At no point during the entire process did the strangeness of it seem to register as a reason to stop. The logic held together just well enough to keep everyone moving forward. And that, more than the bats or the fire or the escaped animals, is the part that I think about when I wonder how humans keep arriving at decisions that look completely obvious in hindsight. And we are nowhere near the strangest ones yet. At the height of what people called civilized justice, a pig was once given a formal trial, assigned legal representation, dressed in human clothing, and brought before a court to answer for a crime. And the court took it completely seriously. We have already moved through bored aristocrats and desperate wartime engineers, through a baboon on a payroll, and a doctor who weaponized sleeping animals. But this is a different kind of strange. This is what happens when an entire society builds a belief system so internally consistent, so airtight in its own logic, that it can produce something like this and call it justice, without a single person in the room questioning the premise. The smell in those courtrooms would have been thick, candle wax and damp stone, and the particular heaviness of a room where important things happened regularly. Scribes sat at wooden desks with ink-stained fingers. Judges wore robes that communicated authority the way uniforms always do, by making the person inside them feel larger than they are. And in the center of all that ceremony, sometimes, was an animal. Pigs were the most common defendants because they lived close to human settlements and occasionally caused serious harm, particularly to small children who were left unsupervised near the animals. When something like that happened, the community needed a response, not just practical, but symbolic. The moral order had been disrupted, and the system needed to visibly restore it. So the animal was brought in. A defense was mounted, seriously, by a real advocate who argued the case with the same preparation he would bring to any other matter. The prosecution presented its evidence. Witnesses were called, and at the end of it all, a verdict was delivered and a sentence carried out. The animal had no understanding of any of it. That was not considered relevant. What mattered was the performance of justice, the public demonstration that wrongdoing had consequences within a system that applied to everything, not just to people. And here's the thing that makes this more than just a strange footnote. The logic underneath it was not stupid. It came from a world where the boundary between human and natural, between legal and moral, was drawn completely differently than we draw it now. The people doing this were not primitive. They were operating inside a fully developed intellectual framework that simply had different foundations than ours. The disturbing part is not that they did it. The disturbing part is wondering what our own descendants will look at someday with exactly the same expression we have right now, reading about a pig in a courtroom. That question, what looks normal until suddenly it does not, is exactly what makes the next story so good. Because this one involves crime. And specifically, it involves a criminal operation so quietly elegant that even knowing it happened, you still have to respect the thinking behind it. The setup was simple. Certain goods were heavily taxed when crossing a particular border, which meant that moving those goods without paying the tax was extremely profitable, which meant that people were going to find a way to do it, no matter what the consequences were. What the smugglers in this case came up with was not a hidden compartment in a wagon, or a bribed official, or a forged document. It was a dog. Specifically, it was multiple dogs, each one prepared in a way that required real skill and real patience. The animal would be brought in, its coat carefully managed, and then a layer of high-value textile material was fitted close against the body, thin enough to move naturally, wrapped in a way that followed the shape of the animal without creating obvious bulk. Over that went a second layer, the outer coat, treated and fitted to look completely normal. Then the dog was sent across, just a dog moving through a checkpoint. The guards saw what they always saw, an animal, unremarkable, passing through with the easy confidence that animals have, because they carry no guilt and project no anxiety. The goods arrived on the other side. The contact waiting there knew exactly what to look for. What I keep coming back to is how much trust this required. Trust in the preparation, trust in the animal, trust in the contact on the other side. Trust that nobody along the route would look too carefully. The whole operation was one nervous dog away from falling apart completely. And yet, it worked, repeatedly, across multiple routes over an extended period, because the people running it understood something that the authorities did not. The most effective hiding place is the one that does not look like a hiding place at all. And if a living, breathing, tail-wagging animal is your container, most people will not think to look twice. That instinct, to trust the ordinary-looking thing, is exactly the instinct that the next story exploits in a completely different direction, and the results are somehow even harder to believe. For hundreds of years, people dropped live frogs into their milk, and it actually worked. And the most unsettling part is that modern science eventually proved why. We just left a world where dogs were dressed in contraband, and courts dressed pigs in human clothing. And both of those stories at least had a kind of twisted human logic running through them. This one is different. This one sits right on the line between ancient habit and genuine discovery. And what makes it strange is not that people did it, but that they were right without knowing why. Picture a stone kitchen, early morning, the fire not yet fully caught, the air still carrying the cold from overnight. A wooden bucket sits near the wall, filled with fresh milk that needs to stay usable for as long as possible. No ice, no sealed containers, no way to slow the process of spoilage except the methods that had been passed down through enough generations that nobody remembered who figured them out first. Someone reaches into a cloth bag, pulls out a damp brown frog, and drops it into the bucket. Not as a joke, not as superstition exactly, as a practice that experience had confirmed worked better than doing nothing. The frog moves around for a moment, settles, and the milk stays fresh longer than it would have otherwise. That is the whole thing. No ceremony, no explanation offered, just a result that repeated reliably enough to become standard. What nobody in that kitchen could have known was that the skin of certain frog species secretes compounds that actively suppress the growth of bacteria. Real chemistry. Measurable, reproducible, eventually documented by researchers who went looking for traditional preservation methods and found this one hiding in rural practice across multiple regions. The frog was a biological tool being used correctly by people who had no framework for understanding the mechanism behind it. They just knew the outcome. And that gap between understanding why something works and knowing that it works is one of the most interesting spaces in all of human history. A huge portion of what we now call medicine, agriculture, and food science started exactly there, in that gap, with someone doing something that looked strange from the outside and producing results that were impossible to argue with. The frog in the milk bucket is almost a perfect symbol for that. Ugly, uncomfortable, completely effective, and thousands of years ahead of the paperwork. Now shift everything. Leave the quiet kitchen and move into the middle of a war, because the next story starts in chaos and ends somewhere that nobody planned for. And it involves a bear, not a metaphor. An actual bear, small enough when the story begins to fit in a soldier's jacket pocket, large enough by the end to carry things that grown men struggled with. His name given to him by the unit that adopted him, was Bruno. He came into the picture the way a lot of wartime mascots did, through a transaction that was equal parts practical and impulsive. A group of soldiers moving through a remote stretch of territory came across a young bear cub that had been separated from its mother. Someone in the unit, probably not thinking more than 5 minutes ahead, decided they were taking him. He was fed from hand, kept warm in the folds of military gear, and carried through terrain that would have killed him on his own. What nobody expected was what happened next. Bruno did not stay a novelty. He grew steadily and impressively. And as he grew, he started watching the men around him the way intelligent animals watch things they are genuinely curious about. He did not just observe. He participated. He followed routines. He showed up where the work was happening and inserted himself into it with a calm confidence that the soldiers found first amusing and then genuinely useful. During active operations in difficult mountain terrain, when supply chains were stretched and everything heavy needed to move by hand over rough ground, Bruno started carrying things. Not trained to, not commanded to. He watched the men loading and moving equipment, and he joined in, picking up crates and shells and moving them the way the others did, because that was what the group was doing, and he was part of the group. The unit's commanding officer, facing the choice between filing an unusual report and simply letting a bear help win a war, chose the practical option. Bruno was given official status. His role was documented. His image became part of the unit's identity, a bear carrying a shell, because that was simply what he did. After the fighting ended and the men went home, Bruno went to a wildlife sanctuary, and for years afterward, former soldiers made the trip to see him, not out of nostalgia for the war, out of something closer to the feeling you get when you want to check on a friend who carried more than his share and deserved to rest. What Bruno did was not trained behavior. It was something that sits in a category that science still does not have a clean word for. And the next story pushes into that same territory from a completely unexpected direction. People paid real money to watch fleas perform in a circus, and the men running those shows became wealthy doing it. And the truly strange part is that the fleas were actually doing the work. We have spent time with a bear who carried artillery and a frog that preserved milk through chemistry nobody understood. And both of those stories had a certain weight to them, a seriousness underneath the strangeness. This one is lighter on the surface and somehow more unsettling underneath, because it is not about survival or war or necessity. It is about entertainment, and specifically about how far human creativity will stretch when there is money on the other side of the idea. The men who built flea circuses were not con artists in the traditional sense. They were craftsmen first. The skills required came directly from watchmaking and the fine instrument trade, the ability to work with materials so small that normal tools were useless, the patience to construct functional mechanisms at a scale most people could not even see clearly without help. They took those skills and applied them to living insects. Tiny harnesses, thinner than a human hair, fitted around the bodies of fleas with a precision that took hours per animal. Small carts, cannon shapes, miniature stage props, all built to a scale where the flea could actually move them, because fleas are extraordinarily strong relative to their size and will push against resistance instinctively. The showman would set up his display on a table, usually in a traveling fair or a dedicated curiosity hall, the air around him smelling of sawdust and lamp oil, and the particular warmth of a crowd pressed close together. He would invite people to lean in and watch, and what they saw, or believed they saw, was a tiny circus. Fleas appearing to duel with miniature swords, a flea pulling a carriage, a flea operating what looked like a cannon. The performance was real in the sense that the animals were genuinely moving the objects. The illusion was in the interpretation, in the story the showman told around the movement, which turned the instinctive struggling of a harnessed insect into a narrative the audience could follow and enjoy. That gap between what was happening and what people believed was happening is what made the whole thing work. The showman was not just an animal handler. He was a storyteller who had found the most extreme possible vehicle for his craft. And the audiences who paid to see it were not stupid. They were doing what audiences have always done, choosing the more interesting version of reality when someone skilled enough offers it to them. Bruno the bear chose to help because something in him recognized the group and wanted to be part of it. The flea had no such choice, but the showman understood something Bruno's soldiers also understood, which is that the story you build around an action matters as much as the action itself. What you call a thing changes what it is. And nowhere in history is that more visible than in the next story, where the story built around an animal carrying out a task determined the outcome of an entire military engagement. The single most consequential battle decision in a particular ancient military campaign was made by watching birds eat, and the general who refused to watch lost everything within hours. We just saw how a showman could shape an audience's reality through the story he told around a small animal's movements. This works in the opposite direction, a story so embedded in a culture that ignoring it carried consequences nobody fully understood until it was too late. The setting is a warship, early morning, the smell of salt and timber, and the particular nervous energy that builds in the hours before a large engagement. The commander is under pressure. His fleet is ready. The strategic moment is correct. Every military calculation points toward moving now. So he calls for the ritual that his culture required before any major action at sea. A handler brings forward the birds kept specifically for this purpose, sacred in the way that certain objects become sacred when enough authority has been invested in them over enough time. Grain is scattered on the deck. Everyone watches. If the birds eat eagerly, the day is favorable. If they hold back, you wait. The birds hold back. They move around the grain without real interest, distracted, unsettled by the sounds and motion of a ship preparing for battle. The commander watches for a moment. He has ships to move and a window that will not stay open. He looks at the birds, looks at his officers, and makes the calculation that a practical man makes when ritual conflicts with opportunity. He orders the birds removed from the situation entirely, and the fleet moves. The battle that followed went badly in ways that seemed almost designed to confirm exactly what the ritual was supposed to prevent. Ships caught in conditions the timing had not accounted for. Coordination that broke down at the critical moment. A defeat that became one of the most studied examples in the military history of that era. Now, the honest version of this story does not claim the birds had actual divine information. What the ritual almost certainly did was force a pause, a moment of collective attention before a decision that could not be undone. It slowed the commander down long enough for doubt to surface, for details to be checked, for the kind of quiet reconsideration that large, irreversible actions deserve. When he removed that pause from the equation, he removed the last friction point between impulse and disaster. The birds were never the point. The stopping was the point. And the next story proves that sometimes the most important thing an animal can do is simply make you wait a moment before you do something you cannot take back. Engineers at a major national broadcast event once had a problem that no machine could solve. And the solution they found was a small animal that most people would not let inside their house. We just spent time with a general who lost everything because he refused to pause, and with a showman who built a career on the gap between what was happening and what people believed was happening. Both of those stories were about the power of interpretation, about how the story around an action shapes its meaning. This one is different. This one is purely practical, almost brutally so. And the fact that it works is not a matter of perception or belief. It is just physics and biology combining in a way that no engineer planned for. The problem was cable. Specifically, getting cable through the narrow conduits that ran inside the walls and floors and ceilings of large, old, complicated buildings. The kind of structures where the original architects never imagined anyone would need to thread a wire from one end to the other without tearing half the place apart. Modern broadcast events required enormous amounts of cable infrastructure, and the buildings where these events happened were often historic, which meant demolition was not an option, and the existing passages were too tight and too irregular for any mechanical solution that existed at the time. Someone, at some point, made the observation that there was one type of animal for whom a dark, narrow, irregular tunnel was not an obstacle, but an invitation. A ferret will go into a hole because that is what ferrets do. They are built for it, long and flexible and completely indifferent to the kind of enclosed space that makes most creatures panic. The idea was simple. Attach a lightweight guideline to the animal, place it at one end of the conduit, and let instinct do the engineering. The ferret moves through, the line follows, and once the line is through, you use it to pull the real cable behind it. That is the entire system. It required training in the sense that the animal needed to be comfortable with the specific conduit and willing to move through on cue, which took patience and the right kind of temperament in the animal. But the core mechanism was just a ferret being a ferret in a place where being a ferret was exactly what was needed. What gets me is the image of it. A polished, high-profile public event, cameras and lights and thousands of people watching, everything coordinated down to the second, and somewhere inside the walls of that building, a ferret is quietly doing the infrastructure work that made the whole thing possible. No credit in the program, no mention in the broadcast. Just a small animal in the dark, doing its job, holding the entire visible spectacle together from the inside. The general who lost his battle ignored the animal in front of him and paid for it. The engineers who deployed the ferret listened to what the animal was naturally capable of and solved a problem that had no other clean answer. The difference between those two outcomes is not intelligence. It is attention. Paying attention to what is actually in front of you instead of what you expected to find there. And the next story takes that idea somewhere much larger and much messier. A growing city was drowning in its own waste, and the only thing standing between total sanitary collapse and something barely functional was a population of free-roaming pigs that nobody had officially hired and nobody could officially fire. We moved from a ferret inside a wall to something that operated on a completely different scale, because the problem this story deals with is not a cable and a conduit. It is an entire urban system failing in real time. And the solution that emerged was not planned by anyone. It just happened, the way a lot of things happen when a city grows faster than its ability to manage itself. Picture the streets of a rapidly expanding city before organized waste collection existed. The smell hit you before you turned the corner. A dense, layered combination of rotting food and animal waste and mud, and the particular sourness of organic material breaking down in warm weather. Wooden crates and kitchen scraps piled against building fronts. Narrow alleys that functioned as informal disposal sites because there was nowhere else for the waste to go. The city was growing faster than any infrastructure could keep pace with, and the gap between what the streets produced and what the system could handle was visible and smellable to everyone who lived there. Into that gap walked the pigs. Not invited, not organized. They were there because the city had not yet made a clear decision about whether they belonged, and in that window of ambiguity, they filled a function. They moved through the streets, eating organic waste, converting what the city discarded into something at least partially useful. And they did it constantly, and without any coordination or management from the humans around them. Reformers found the whole arrangement horrifying, and they were not wrong. The pigs also caused chaos, moved unpredictably through crowds, and created their own layer of mess, even as they cleaned up another. Poorer residents had a more complicated relationship with the animals, because in some cases the pigs were partially theirs, a mobile food source living on the city's discards. Wealthier residents wanted them gone because the pigs were incompatible with the image of a modern, ordered urban environment. The argument went on for years, and what it really was, underneath the sanitation complaints and the property disputes, was a fight about what kind of city this was going to be. The pigs were a symptom of a system that had not yet decided what it was. When the decision finally came and the animals were removed, it was not because the city had found a cleaner solution. It was because the city had decided it needed to look like it had one. And that gap between looking like you have solved a problem and actually solving it is something the next story explores from a direction that is stranger and more beautiful than anything we have covered so far. Wealthy people in multiple different eras, completely independently of each other, arrived at the same idea of gluing precious stones onto a living animal and calling it interior design. And not one of them seemed to find this strange. We just watched a city pretend it had solved a problem by removing the visible evidence of it. And that gap between appearance and reality is exactly where this next story lives. Because what we're talking about now is the most extreme version of that impulse ever put into practice. Not hiding a problem behind a cleaner surface, decorating a living creature to perform the idea of wealth so completely that the animal itself becomes the statement. The first time I came across this, it seemed like an isolated eccentricity, the kind of thing one unusual person does once and never repeats. Then I found it in a second culture, then a third, separated by geography and centuries, and that is when it stopped feeling like a quirk and started feeling like a window into something consistent about human nature. The details shift depending on where you look. In one context, it was tortoises, slow enough to stay roughly where you placed them, their shells fitted with gold leaf and small inlaid stones so that the animal moved across an expensive rug like a living piece of decorative art. The effect in a candle-lit room must have been genuinely striking, the glint of gold catching the light as the animal moved in its slow, indifferent way across the floor, while guests pretended this was a normal thing to encounter at a gathering. In another context, it was beetles, specific species chosen for their natural iridescence, then further adorned and attached to clothing with a fine chain so that the insect moved across fabric like a brooch that had decided to explore. In yet another, it was small lizards fitted with delicate fixtures and worn at social events, where the conversation piece was literally alive and occasionally looked directly at the person you were talking to. What connects all of these is not the specific animal. It is the logic underneath the choice. Static wealth, gold on a shelf, or gems in a case communicates abundance. But living wealth, abundance that breathes and moves and introduces genuine unpredictability into a controlled environment, communicates something beyond abundance. It communicates the belief that everything, including nature itself, exists within your sphere of influence. That is a very old and very specific kind of power statement, and it recurs across history because the impulse behind it does not change, even when the civilization does. The city that removed its pigs to look modern was doing a version of the same thing, managing the appearance of control over the messy, living, unpredictable reality underneath. The difference is that the tortoise with the gilded shell was honest about what it was doing. It was pure performance with no pretense of practicality. And there is something almost refreshing about that level of transparency, even if the animal involved had a different opinion on the arrangement. The most important safety technology in the underground mining industry for over a century weighed less than a handful of coins and died so that the men around it could live. And for most of that time, nobody called it a sacrifice. We have moved through excess and spectacle, through cities and courts and living jewelry, and now the story shifts into something darker and quieter and much harder to shake. Because this is not about power or performance or ingenuity in the entertaining sense. This is about the brutal arithmetic of dangerous work, and about a creature that was placed into the middle of that arithmetic without any say in the matter. The underground environment that miners worked in was hostile in ways that the surface world gave almost no preparation for. The darkness was total when the lamps went out. The sound was different, muffled and close. The weight of everything above you present in a way you felt rather than heard. The air moved strangely, or sometimes did not move at all, and in certain conditions that stillness meant something specific and deadly was accumulating in the space around you. Gases that had no color and no smell could build to dangerous concentrations before any human sense registered the change. By the time a man felt the first symptoms, the window for getting out was already closing. The solution that emerged was not designed by an engineer. It was arrived at through observation over time, the recognition that certain small birds responded to changes in air quality much faster and much more visibly than any human could. A bird placed in that environment would show distress, become still, lose its grip on its perch, long before the concentration reached the threshold where a person would notice anything wrong. That response time was the margin between getting out and not getting out. So the birds went underground. Carried in small cages by men descending into the dark each morning, the birds becoming the most important instrument in the entire operation, more reliable than any gauge, more consistent than any other method available. When the bird was active and alert, the air was safe. When the bird went quiet, you moved. The men who worked those shifts developed a particular relationship with the animals they carried, checking them constantly, the way you check something you depend on completely. Not affection exactly, though that was sometimes part of it. Something closer to the acute attention you give to the one thing standing between you and a very bad outcome. When a bird died on a shift, it was not mourned the way a pet would be mourned. It was understood. The bird had done what it was there to do. The phrase that grew out of this practice is still used today to describe the first sign of a hidden danger approaching. What most people do not think about when they use it is that the original was not a metaphor. It was a small creature in a cage, going silent in the dark so that someone else could hear the warning in time. And the next story takes that same idea, an animal as the margin between disaster and survival, and scales it up to a level that still seems impossible until you see the numbers. Trained rats have walked across active minefields and saved more human lives than most decorated soldiers, and the world has largely never heard their names. We just left the underground dark where small birds went silent so miners could escape in time. And that story was about an animal placed into danger as a tool, with no choice and no understanding of the stakes. This one is different in a way that matters, because the rats I am about to tell you about are also placed into danger, also have no understanding of the geopolitical reasons the mines are there, also receive no explanation of what they are doing or why. But the outcome is not their death. It is their breakfast. And that small difference in the arrangement changes everything about how the story feels. The fields where these animals work are real places, warm and dry on the surface, the kind of terrain that looks ordinary from a distance. Low grass, scattered trees, the smell of red earth in the sun. But underneath, at irregular intervals, are buried devices left over from conflicts that ended years or decades earlier. Pressure sensitive, still functional, waiting with complete indifference for the wrong weight to pass over them. Human deminers working these fields with metal detectors move slowly, one careful step at a time, covering small areas over long hours. The physical and psychological cost of the work enormous. The rats cover the same ground in a fraction of the time. They are large animals, much bigger than most people expect when they first encounter them, solid and deliberate in their movements, wearing small harnesses attached to a guideline that keeps them working in a systematic pattern across the field. They have been trained over months to recognize the specific chemical signature of the explosive compounds buried in the soil. When they detect it, they stop and scratch at the surface. Then they get a piece of banana or a bit of peanut and move on. That is the whole transaction. The rat finds a mine, signals its location, receives its reward, and continues. It does not understand that it just saved the life of the farmer whose field this is. It does not understand that the device it located has been there longer than some of the children now living in the village nearby. It understands that scratching in the right spot produces something good to eat. And that gap between what the rat knows and what the rat achieves is one of the most quietly extraordinary things I have found in this entire subject. We have spent this whole story looking at moments where humans used animals for purposes that ranged from brilliant to shameful. The birds in the dark, the bear carrying shells, the pig in the courtroom, the frog in the milk. Most of those stories have at least some shadow in them, some cost the animal paid that the humans around it did not fully reckon with. This one is different. This one is a genuine collaboration, imperfect and asymmetrical in its understanding, but real in its results, and honest in what it offers the animal in return. And after everything we have covered, that feels like the right note to approach the end on. So here's where we have arrived after all of it. The chickens in tinted glasses, the baboon on the official payroll, the bear with military rank, the frog in the bucket, the ferret in the wall, the pig in the courtroom, the bird going silent in the dark, the rat scratching at the edge of a buried device in a sunlit field. 33 moments, and the thread running through all of them is this. Animals have been inside human civilization the entire time, doing work that shaped outcomes, holding things together, filling the gaps that human systems could not reach, and the official version of history barely mentions any of it. Every era we covered thought of itself as the sophisticated one. The aristocrats believed they represented the peak of culture while they launched terrified animals into the air for entertainment. The military planners believed they were being rational while they strapped devices onto sleeping bats. The courts believed they were upholding justice while they dressed livestock in human clothing and assigned them lawyers. The sophistication of a civilization has never protected it from the particular blindness of believing its own story about itself. And animals, which have no story about themselves, no narrative to defend, no image to maintain, have consistently just done what they were capable of doing and let the results speak. The bear did not know he was becoming a symbol. The rat does not know it is a hero. The frog in the bucket did not know it was practicing biochemistry. They just did what they were. And somehow, across every era and every culture we looked at, that turned out to be exactly enough. Now here is the question I want you to sit with, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments, because I think it reveals something real about how each of us sees the world. If you had to choose one animal from everything we covered today, the one whose story you think deserves to be remembered and taught, and actually included in the history books, which one would it be, and why? Not the funniest one, the one that actually mattered. Drop it below. And if this story stayed with you, if any part of it made you see something differently, hit like and subscribe, because there is a lot more where this came from, and the next one goes somewhere you are not expecting.